Welcome to SB Talks. Today I am joined by author and philanthropic advisor Peter Winneke. Welcome, Peter.
Terrific to be here, Vinny.
Peter is the author of the book Give While You Live, a practical guide to more and better giving in Australia. Look forward to our chat and welcome to all our listeners. I'd like to start, if I can, Peter, by asking you to explain the role of a philanthropic advisor, not something that everyone is necessarily familiar with.
Yeah, sure, Vinny. A philanthropic advisor is really a guide for a family looking to get a little bit more serious about their giving. So, sort of helping them determine, do they need a philanthropic structure? If they do, the type of structure, and then helping them develop some sort of giving program, and if appropriate, getting the next generation engaged as well.
Wonderful. Now, I'm going to guess that you didn't leave school and decide this is the path for me. I'm going to, mom and dad, I'm going to go off and become a philanthropic advisor. Share with us a little bit of the journey that, no doubt, the different experiences you've had that's ultimately led to you going down this path.
Yeah, no, I certainly didn't, Vinny. You're right. Look, I, like a lot of people, had no idea what I wanted to do. I fell into commerce. I did insolvency for 8 years. I did acquisitions at a listed media company for 8 years. Enjoyed all of that. Learnt a lot. But I didn't marry until late in life, so I had the flexibility to. I travelled for every winter. I'd go backpacking for a month or so.
Escape the Melbourne chill.
I possibly was doing that, Vinny. I was definitely doing that, and I wouldn't mind being there now. It's freezing, but so I did the Europes and the west coast of the States early on, and then from then on, it was primarily visiting low to middle income countries. And I wasn't doing this to save the world; it was just to get off the well-worn tourist trail. So I saw a lot of inequity, a lot of injustice, and then in a nutshell, I was looking for a little bit more purpose in my life. So on one of these trips, I thought, well, geez, a lot of pontificating going on here, Peter. There's not much action. So I sort of stumbled into the philanthropic sector over 20 years ago and researching the sector in Australia, the UK, US, Canada. And I could see that 20 years ago we had quite a small philanthropic sector in Australia, and I couldn't see many professionals trying to drive the growth of the sector. So that was my sort of light bulb moment. I thought, right, let's use these commercial skills that I've developed in the last 16 years and use those to try and grow the size of the philanthropic pie in Australia.
So it's very much a journey, not just about advising, but really to try and increase the pie rather than how it's divided.
Exactly. Certainly in the early years, for a number of years, it was definitely about how do we grow the pie. And then as my experience grew in the philanthropic sector, I realised that, well, there's no point just growing the pie. We need to give more effectively. So I started to give that a bit more thought as well.
Now, I love the name of your book, Give While You Live. I understand there's quite an interesting story that's the inspiration behind that.
Yeah, look, Vinny, I know that you know of Chuck Feeney. Chuck is an Irish American, not well known in Australia. He should be. He and a few mates sort of discovered duty free shopping in the 70s, and they made a lot of money. Chuck in particular, I mean, he made about $8 billion, and then in the following decades gave the lot away. And Chuck was a really humble guy. Sort of realised that he didn't need much in life. He really thought a lot about his life legacy. And he used to say, he had this phrase, giving while living, which I acknowledge in my book. Why would you leave the fun of giving to someone else when you're gone? And it's a classic Chuck, sort of wise, concise, and I had it's always dangerous to meet your heroes because you never quite know what they're like. But I did have the incredible privilege of spending 20 minutes with Chuck a decade ago, and absolute delight to spend some time with a very unique human being.
And no doubt has inspired you a bit along on your journey.
He has, and look, on that occasion when I met him, someone took a photo, and I'm sitting in my study at the moment, looking at a photo on my wall where I'm looking a bit younger with Chuck. A real privilege to spend some time with him, and he drives my work every day because my sort of thinking is, he was unique, and of course he had staggering wealth. but you don't need to have staggering wealth to consider, one's legacy and how we can get more engaged with the community. And so he does drive my passion.
That's wonderful. And it's an excellent jumping off point, because what I'm really keen for us to focus on in the podcast today is to have this as a bit of a starting point for those families that are having the discussions, that are thinking about what they might want to do, get more involved in the philanthropic scene, giving back, but not quite sure possibly where to start. And I'd like to talk, if I can, in the book you discuss how much is enough for you and the next generation. Can you share a little bit more around those discussions that you have when you are approaching families for the first time to think about this?
Yeah, and of course, Vinny, we know that a lot of people in Australia and throughout the world don't have surplus wealth, but we're obviously talking about those that have some form of surplus wealth. And look, I've worked with a number of families who have sat down and thought, well, how much is enough? Which is not a common thing to do, but families they've actually sat down with Excel spreadsheet and worked out. Look, we own our house and we own our holiday house. We've got surplus wealth, but let's work out what it is. Let's work out what we need. We want to pay for the kids' tertiary education. We might have aging parents. We might want to go to Europe every year to escape the Australian winter, particularly down south. And then so you sort of nut through a spreadsheet. I've worked with a number of families doing this. So they actually work out, okay, we need X. And we've got 10x. So they've actually worked out, when families do this calculation, Vinny, they often, they know they've got a surplus, but they're often surprised by the level of the surplus. And then it's interesting because then the letting go becomes a bit easier. And of course, part of that equation of how much is enough is, a lot of families have kids, so a very delicate issue and sort of a very personal issue of,
I was going to say it's very personal, as in, even if you have 10x, you could have 100 families with 10x of what they need, and each one's thought process and decision making is going to be very different.
That's exactly right. And of course, every family is at a different stage of their philanthropic journey. Some have started decades ago, others are just getting going because they might have just had a liquidity event in recent years. But we don't have a strong culture of giving in this country, and that's not surprising, Vinny, because most of the wealth in this country has only been created in the last 3 to 4 decades. So we haven't had the wealth of countries like America have had generations and generations going back, over 130 plus years. Ours is new, so we're still trying to work out what to do with it, and that's part of this process of families. It's interesting when you see families work out, well, how much is enough, and as I say, part of that equation is, well, how much do the kids need, which is a really interesting equation in itself, and every family has a different view on that. In my book, I use the line that some of your listeners would have heard of before. Warren Buffett, the US investor, on this issue, he says, leave enough to your kids to do anything in life, but not enough to do nothing. Again, it's a classic Buffett, again, sort of wise and concise. But yeah, it's an interesting issue. And of course, there's no right and wrong answer on that issue.
Yeah, I was going to say that in your discussions with families, you're having them approach it in different ways, and you've got a lot of complexity and
Yeah.
a lot of education on that journey. Do you mind if before we delve a little bit deeper into that, set out a few of the tent poles? We're familiar with making charitable contributions, donations, I should say. People benefit from tax deductions on those. There's a couple of structures that can exist out there that people can take advantage of, things like private and public ancillary funds. Do you maybe mind setting a little bit of the backdrop on those?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, sure, Vinny. There's sort of three major ones. The first one's a private charitable trust. They're not tax effective. They provide more flexibility with your giving, but they're not a deductible gift recipient. So gifts going into a private charitable trust, you don't get a tax deduction for those. So they're not widely used. But the two main ones that are used are as you suggested, firstly the private ancillary fund, and then secondly the public ancillary fund. The public ancillary fund tend to be useful for families who might want to gift into that fund perhaps up to $500,000 or maybe a bit more. And you can do that. These are they usually fit under the umbrella trust structure of an entity such as a community foundation or the like, and they can be set up very promptly for. And often the initial gift can be, $10,000 to $20,000, and you can build on that. If families are looking to do something a bit larger, with $500,000 to $1 million or higher, often a family will set up a private ancillary fund, um, and that's because it gives them more control. There's a little bit more governance involved with that because there's a separate charitable trust that's established. You need to have you can have family directors, but you need to have one independent director. But you've got more control. So it's almost like a self-managed super fund. You control it yourself. So you can either manage the money yourself, or you've got the ability to hire and fire the fund manager, and you've got total discretion on where the gifts to charities are going. So there's a few things that families need to think about there. And again, as we say, every family is different. So it's important. That's part of the philanthropic advisor role. It's really important to have a lot of discussions with the family to determine what do they actually want to achieve, and then from there you can work out what the right structure is. So do it that way around. Don't set up the structure and then work out what you want to do.
And for the benefit of our listeners and those that are clients, you may be familiar with the Stanford Brown Charitable Foundation. It is, in fact, a public ancillary fund, like Peter describes, where a number of the clients can come together and have sub-funds underneath that structure and can benefit from that gifting in and have control over where their own gifts go from their sub-fund, but they're essentially clubbed together with other clients to sort of share some of the costs and the overhead in running that. But at some point, if someone elects to step up a notch in terms of they can roll their balance across, much like a superannuation to a private fund.
It was really exciting to hear that, Vinny, when you mentioned that a number of months ago, because a lot of wealth advisors have not set up a public ancillary fund. So I was really excited to hear that.
Thank you. I'd like to now benefit the listeners with some of your top tips from your many years of experience working across the industry, working with families, about how they approach their thoughts around this space. And I'll start with number one if I can, and that is to pause and think about your legacy. Can you share more on that, please?
Yeah, I think it's important to sort of consider, it's like anything, any new task, major task you're taking on. What do we want to achieve here? How do I want to be thought about when I'm gone? So I think it's really important to think about what do we want to do and how do we want to do it? Do we want to set up a structure now and get on with it, or as a Chuck Feeney would, or let's manage that through our will? How do you want to approach it? So a lot of deep thought around that would be a good starting point.
And then related to that, you talk about the next point two, and trying to think about what, after you've probably decided what you want to do in terms of you want to do more, but how you direct it, starting to think about what upsets you in your community or the world and what you want to do about it.
Yeah, I think traditionally, Vinny, certainly in Australia, a lot of families, when they're giving, they tend to give across maybe 5 or 6 what I would call focus areas. They might be doing a little bit to the arts, a little bit to First Nations Australians, perhaps some early childhood development. I guess that's what I call the sort of spray and pray approach. Spray it around a bit and hopefully it does some good. It would make sense, if you want to maximise your impact, to have some deep thought around what does upset you. What do you want to try and address in the world in collaboration with others? So ideally, just pick 1 or 2 or 3 areas, delve into those, skill up, work out who's doing some really interesting work in that space, and partner with them. So it's really thinking about, okay, what's our focus going to be?
Yeah, wonderful. And related to that, one of your other top 5 is getting the family engaged. And I do know from our experience, where we have worked with families that are going through this journey and thinking about what they want to do, one of the top benefits they've got out of it is they found it as a way to start to talk to the next generation about the family money. Obviously, there's thoughts of succession in that, but also what's important to the family and what they really would like to tackle?
Yeah, it's a really important issue, Vinny, and I think it's one that a lot of families in Australia haven't picked up on. And I talk about regularly, is the extraordinary educational tool a family foundation can be for the next generation. And whether the structure is a private ancillary fund or a public ancillary fund, it doesn't matter. Incredible opportunity to get the kids engaged, and depending on the age of the grandchildren, get the grandchildren engaged. So many learnings. I mean, a foundation has finite resources. Whether it's got $200,000 in it or 10 million, it's finite resources. So the first thing the kids are learning about are investment strategies. So that's terrific, including possibly, hopefully, impact investing. And then it's okay. What are we going to do with this structure? What's our vision? What's our mission? Let's nut through that, and then okay, what are our focus areas, and what's our strategy to have an impact, and then how are we going to implement that, and then how are we going to measure the impact? I mean, a family foundation is a microcosm of a business. It just happens to be in the business of grant making for social good. So just a huge range of learnings for the kids, and also even governance issues. Whether the foundation meetings are held in your boardroom, in your office, or around the family's kitchen table, it's a structure. Minutes will be taken. There'll be accountabilities for various family members, and also it's getting the family together as a collective unit, focusing on some of the bigger issues in the world. So it's such an amazing educational tool.
Yeah, and I think in our experience, one of the things that families naturally don't do enough of is talk about money, because it is a bit of a taboo subject, and this is a great way to bring them together and talk about it in a way that is an incredibly positive experience for all involved.
Yeah, it is fitting, and it's sort of in the sort of the safe environment of the family foundation. As you say, I mean, and you're starting off with an investment strategy. We've got a corpus here, it's X dollars. How are we going to manage it? So great learnings.
Your point number 4: develop a structured approach to your giving.
Yes, and I sort of touched on this a bit earlier. Try and have some focus. Pick 1 to 2, 3 areas, and then if you do that, you've got the ability to do a bit of research, either yourself or get others to do it. Who's doing the best work in this space? And then you've got the privilege of meeting some really smart, what I call for-purpose leaders who are working in that space, working with them, and reviewing their plans, their strategies, and how they're going to measure impact. And if you just pick particularly if you just pick 1 or 2 areas, and then within those areas just work with a couple of partners, that's the best way you've got of trying to maximise your impact. So I think that's quite important. Early on in the philanthropic journey, you might be just testing a few focus areas and a few relationships. That makes sense. But then as the journey continues, you'll work out within a couple of years where there's a bit of traction and where you really, the family has some passion. That's a typical philanthropic journey. Sort of, there does tend to be a bit of spray and pray early on, and then after that, delving in with a bit more focus.
It's kind of like a maturing in your approach as you begin to learn what you're getting most reward from, and where you're getting most bang for the buck, dare I say, in terms of your impact.
That's exactly right, and nothing wrong with testing. Right, I mean, it's a good thing to test relationships, and then as I say, hopefully you're having some successes, and then you can sort of focus on those as you continue down the pathway.
And your 5th tip is to practice best practice giving. What does that mean?
Yeah, best practice giving, Vinny, really, I mean, most philanthropic grants in Australia, most donations are for a project for 1 to 2 years. Best practice is really, okay, you've worked out your 2 focus areas, you've worked out 2 or 3 partners who are doing really interesting work in that space, then back them long term with multi-year unrestricted funding. Charity CEOs will tell you, I talk to them regularly, they very rarely receive long-term unrestricted funding. So And it's important. It means they can shore up their budget. If you're making a commitment for at least 3 to 5 years, bearing in mind, Vinny, up front, you discuss the KPIs, the key performance indicators, and work out, well, okay, we really like what you're doing, but how do you measure impact and what are the milestones along the way? And once you've agreed them up front, then you can see whether the organisation, your funding partner, is on the right track. And if they're not, if you've only got a handful of relationships, the smaller number of relationships, the better chance you've got at really strengthening those relationships, which will mean there's going to be more honesty in the relationship. So if things are going off track with a charity, which they often do for various reasons, you can have an honest conversation with the executive team, or what's going on here. And because you've built a close relationship, you'll get more honesty from them around, well, actually, we've gone off track this quarter for these reasons. This is how we're going to get it back on track. Great. So pick a couple of focus areas, and then long-term unrestricted funding is the best approach.
And makes perfect sense. Like any business, if you're trying to plan or invest for what outcomes you want to get over the next 2 or 3 years, it's a lot easier to do it when you know what income you've got to make those investments. And that could be people, that could be infrastructure. It all costs money. So if they have the confidence that that's there behind them, they can have the confidence to go make those investments.
Yeah, and that's a really important point, Vinny. There's a lot of focus on, well, what's the administration cost of a charity? I mean, every charity is different, and some admin expenditure percentage on admin, some should be high, some should be low, depending on whether they're labour intensive, etc. I mean, when we're investing in a listed company, we never look at what the admin costs are. That's we look at the a whole lot of other indicators. So how do they measure impact, which is often profitability. So what's the charity trying to do? What's success look like for them? How do they measure their impact? That's what should be that should be the focus.
Wonderful. Peter, can I ask you any closing thoughts for listeners, for clients as they approach this area?
Yeah, look, it's I think what we need to talk more about in Australia is the incredible joy and satisfaction of giving. I think, again, I touched on this earlier. Most of our wealth has been created just in the last 3 or 4 decades. So we don't have a strong culture of giving. We've got some amazing families. We know that. People doing amazing things. But we haven't built a really strong culture of giving amongst high net worth families. And so that's primarily because the money is new. And I think we're just still, families are learning on the extraordinary educational tool the foundation can be for the next generation, and the joy of giving and one's legacy. I mean, we only get one crack at our life. And as a colleague said to me a few years ago, he's a successful guy. He knows a lot of successful people, and he loves to say to them, Vinny, look, I know you've built up your business, and I know you've got a beautiful family, and I know your golf handicaps get below, single digits now. Have you done your best work yet? And they often say to him, "Oh, gee, I don't know whether I have." So it's, we're not here for long. Have we done our best work yet? I think that's an interesting thing to reflect on.
Have we done our best work yet? I could not find a better way to finish that. Thank you, Peter. That's been really interesting. Congratulations on your book, Give While You Live. Thank you very much for your time this morning, and thank you to all our listeners.
Thanks, Vinny. I really enjoyed it.
You're very welcome. Take care.